Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most mysterious and unusual stories of the ancient world, a place where honor, power, and sacrifice intertwine to create a sisterhood revered by the entire Roman Empire, the Vestal Virgins. Before we begin this journey full of surprises, if you enjoy deep historical explorations told from a completely fresh perspective, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any upcoming videos. I promise that all content is shared under the spirit of fair use, analysis, commentary, and storytelling in the channel's own unique style. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's amazing to see a global community gathering together to uncover the mysteries of the past. Now get ready, dim the lights, relax, and step into a story the Romans never wanted to be forgotten. To understand the true weight carried by the Vestal Virgins, we need to temporarily forget the image of gentle nuns holding holy books with eyes lifted toward the heavens. In ancient Rome, the Vestals were not women whispering prayers in the dark. They were the spiritual pillars on which an entire empire depended. Rome believed that if these girls kept themselves pure, alert, and diligent in their duties, the city would continue to flourish. And if they failed, even by a single misstep or a single extinguished flame, every disaster from drought to plague could be blamed directly on them. That may sound excessive, but to the Romans, this was perfectly logical. An empire that relied on the flight patterns of birds to decide battle dates would not find it unreasonable to entrust the survival of its people to 6 little girls. In fact, this was their symbolic risk management strategy. If the Vestals are fine, Rome is fine. If the Vestals slip, someone must pay. And unfortunately, the ones who paid were rarely senators. They were the girls themselves. However, before becoming living symbols, before donning their sacred white garments and walking through the famous marble house, the Vestals had to undergo a selection process that many people today would certainly deem unacceptable. The Romans called it captio, meaning seizure, and they meant it quite literally. Imagine you are a 6 or 7-year-old girl sitting in your family's villa, snacking on grapes or playing with small wax dolls. Your life then is fairly simple. Learn proper manners, practice reading, and avoid making your mother angry. Suddenly, the Pontifex Maximus, the most powerful religious leader in Rome, walks through the gate with an entourage. He is not there to pray or bless anyone. He is there to choose a girl. And if he points at you, your family has no right to refuse. No negotiation, no denial, no, I need time to think. Some families tried to act proud, telling themselves their daughter was given the highest honor, but everyone knew that was just emotional gift wrapping, like receiving a mysterious present and hoping it doesn't explode. Because from that moment on, the girl's old life was almost erased. When a girl was chosen, the ritual began immediately. First, she was led across the square under the curious and relieved gazes of the crowd, relieved because it wasn't their child. Then she stepped into the temple of Vesta, where every trace of her childhood was stripped away, quite literally. The locks of her childhood hair were cut off and buried, symbolizing her departure from the mortal world. Next came the white veil and simple robe, clear signs that from this moment she belonged not to her family but to the gods. All of this happened before the girl even understood the meaning of the word sacred. In a single moment, she became both revered and confined. After the ceremony, she was taken to the house of the Vestal Virgins, not a shabby religious hut, but one of the most luxurious complexes in Rome. Towering columns, marble walls, murmuring fountains, private gardens, and long corridors seemingly designed to echo the footsteps of destiny. It looked like paradise for the elite, if the residents had the freedom to come and go. The Vestals did not. Inside that house, they were raised by servants, taught by priests, protected by guards, and watched by the entire city. Rome granted them privileges no other women had: the right to own property, the right to sit in seats of honor, even the right to command men in certain situations. But in exchange, they had to give up the most basic elements of human life: freedom and youth. And then the real work began. Not physical labor, but an absolute spiritual responsibility: keeping the eternal flame burning. It sounds beautiful and poetic, but even the smallest negligence could lead to disaster. If the flame went out, Rome believed the goddess's protection vanished with it. And if that happened, people would certainly come looking for the Vestals for punishment. In the modern world, forgetting to turn off the stove might get you scolded. In ancient Rome, letting the flame go out might get you publicly punished in ways no one would want to imagine. From here, their lives truly began, a life both honored and confined, praised as living goddesses yet treated like walking talismans. Rome didn't just expect the Vestal virgins to be perfect, they expected them to embody perfection. No trembling, no mistakes, no slips, and absolutely nothing that might suggest the gods were angry. That was their destiny. And to Rome, it made perfect sense. When a Vestal crossed the boundary between apprenticeship and official service, she didn't just step into a new chapter. She stepped into a world where every breath could be interpreted as a sacred sign. And if you think that sounds excessive, remember, this is Rome, a city where a chicken losing its appetite could be seen as a bad omen, serious enough to make the entire Senate hold an emergency meeting. And within that context, the Vestal priestesses became living symbols. They were not ordinary individuals, they were walking cosmic signals. The common people looked to them to predict the city's fate. The elite looked to them for divine justification for their political decisions. Generals looked to them for luck. And the gods? Well, according to the Romans, the gods stared at them day and night as if there were only 6 noteworthy humans in all of Rome. Thus, in this second decade, a Vestal's life was an endless chain of duties, so many that even modern project managers would cry if they read the list. In the morning, they tended the fire. At noon, they prepared offerings. In the afternoon, they joined rituals. And in the evening, they purified the sacred space. And at any moment, a group of priests could sprint in to announce that the omens have changed. We must redo everything. Worse still, this was the period in which they became famous. Not the pleasant kind of fame one enjoys, the kind where everyone knows who you are, but no one sees you as a normal human anymore. A Vestal walking into the street could silence an entire forum as if an angel had descended to inspect the quality of pork. Officials bowed to them, prisoners begged them, merchants sought blessings from them. And if a Vestal picked up a stone, someone would immediately assume it was part of a ritual, and the entire crowd would stop breathing for fear of disturbing the sacred act. But power always comes with a price, and for the priestesses of Vesta, that price was never small. The truth was, despite being respected, they were monitored like noble prisoners. Every word, gesture, and emotional state could be interpreted as a divine signal. If a Vestal frowned, someone would ask, "Is that an omen?" If she coughed, someone would immediately run to pray. And that was only part of it, because in the Roman worldview, there was no such thing as a small mistake. A single mistake, even accidental, could lead to an emergency Senate meeting, mass animal sacrifices, and absurd accusations that Vesta is angry. But the most terrifying thing they faced during their official service wasn't the sacred flame, nor the rituals. It was a punishment whispered about across the empire with awe, the punishment for breaking the vow. Rome did not simply treat the Vestal's vow of chastity seriously. They treated it more seriously than a soldier's oath of loyalty, an official's oath of office, or even a marital vow. Because if a Vestal lost her purity, the Romans believed the world could descend into chaos, not only because of religious belief, but because the psychological stability of the entire community depended on this symbol. And Rome had its own method of punishment, a method that many modern historians can only describe with one phrase: beautifully cruel. The punishment was not burning, not hanging, not exile. No. Rome chose the worst possible method that shed no blood because they wanted to preserve ritual purity. They buried the priestess alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of water, a small amount of food, an oil lamp, and eternal silence. The moment the door was sealed was the moment Rome felt they had done the right thing for the gods. And all of this happened while the man involved, if there was one, was beaten and executed immediately. A justice that Rome considered perfect and balanced. But the more incredible thing was, this happened very rarely, not because the Romans were merciful, but because the Vestals understood clearly that a single mistake could end their life in the most tragic way imaginable. But if they completed the full 30 years of service, surviving political turmoil, harsh winters, endless rituals, and being treated like Rome's spiritual thermometer, they would be freed. And that moment is one of the most beautiful images in ancient history. A Vestal, around 35 to 40 years old, walking out of the temple after fulfilling her duties. No more sacred garments, no more supervision, no more eyes following her every move. Just a woman, but the most powerful woman in Rome. She could own property, join society, marry if she wished, though few dared to wed someone protected by the gods, and even influence politics. No other woman in Rome, except a retired Vestal, possessed such power and freedom. 30 years of sacrifice exchanged for 30, 40, or more years of a life entirely her own. A heavy price, but a worthy reward. And it is precisely this blend of glory and tragedy that makes the Vestals one of the most unique symbols of the ancient world. The trial of a Vestal accused of wrongdoing was never a place to seek justice. It was more like a carefully staged Roman tragedy in which the audience had already decided the ending before the curtain was even raised. The Pontifex Maximus, who played the role of judge, often stepped out with a solemn expression, though deep down he was probably wishing it were his day off. No one wanted to be the person to condemn a woman whom the entire empire believed could shake the city's fate simply by breathing too hard. The atmosphere of the trial was always thick with religious tension. Every question was delivered as if the judges were listening for a divine reaction in the air. But the most terrifying thing was something everyone knew but no one said aloud. No answer was good enough. If the Vestal trembled with fear, they claimed she trembled from guilt. If she stayed calm, they said she was callous. If she spoke too little, she was hiding something. If she spoke too much, she was making things up. No path led to victory, only a long, winding road leading straight to death in silence. And when the sentence was announced, Rome held yet another ritual. Not a celebration, but a solemn funeral procession in which the condemned woman was led through the city as a quiet reminder to the other priestesses. This is what happens when a religious symbol dares to behave like a human. A condemned Vestal was not bound, not beaten, not dragged along the streets. Rome was very careful about this. They believed that touching a Vestal in any way that harmed her body would desecrate the ritual. So she had to walk on her own with whatever dignity she had left. And that, ironically, made the journey even more painful. The crowd stood on both sides of the road. Everyone was silent. No jeers, no insults. Rome loved its rituals so much that even its cruelty was wrapped in reverence. When she reached the underground chamber, they handed her a small lamp. Its faint light was the final symbol of what she once protected, the sacred flame. But this time, no god stood on her side. She descended the last steps, and the door was sealed. In that moment, silence became the final verdict, a verdict the Romans convinced themselves meant they weren't really killing her. And so the story ended, at least for the unlucky Vestals. But most Vestals did not live tragic lives. They lived in a world of privileges, powerful enough to turn senators into noisy background characters. This made their existence a perfect paradox, prisoners of ritual, yet living goddesses at the heart of the city. From the outside, their lives looked like an endless chain of religious ceremonies designed to please the gods. But on the inside, the power they possessed could make some Romans rethink their entire list of life priorities. Because becoming a Vestal didn't just mean keeping the flame alive, it meant stepping into society with a status no one else could attain. If Rome had ancient superstars, the Vestals were exactly that. They could stop an execution with a single touch. They could walk freely through the city like fully independent citizens, while the rest of Roman women were bound to male guardians. They had seats of honor at every festival, every race, every public event. No senator dared challenge them for a seat. No governor dared cut in line. Their very presence was considered a blessing. If a Vestal left her home in the morning, her cloak drifting lightly in the breeze, passersby would quietly think, "Today will be a good day. Vesta has smiled." Yet these privileges did nothing to lessen the pressure on their shoulders. While others had the right to make mistakes, a Vestal did not. If a soldier slipped during a parade, the crowd laughed and moved on. But if a Vestal slipped, the entire city began whispering about omens and impending disasters. They lived in Rome's embrace, but also under Rome's suspicious gaze. And then, after those 30 long years, so long that many Romans didn't even live that long, a remarkable day finally arrived. It wasn't a major festival. There were no parades, no musicians, no showers of flowers, just a quiet morning when the Vestal performed her duties one last time, set down her ritual items, and stepped out of the Temple of Vesta. At that moment, someone who had been bound by the strictest rules was declared free. She could marry, though few dared to wed a woman protected by the gods for 3 decades. She could live as she pleased. She could own property, participate in social life, even advise politicians. Roman leaders believed the wisdom of a Vestal who had completed her service was a national treasure, the product of 30 years of discipline, observation, and ceremony that ordinary people could never comprehend. But most importantly, she had survived what the Romans considered the harshest spiritual trial a woman could endure. And in the stillness of that morning, as she walked out of the temple and into the world as a free woman, she became living proof of the power of a religious symbol and the perseverance of the human spirit. A full cycle completed. From the frightened child chosen in a crowd, to the keeper of the sacred flame, to the spiritual balance of all Rome, to a mature woman leaving the empire of ritual with the respect of the entire city. A journey that even Roman historians had to admit there is nothing in the world quite the life of a Vestal. The strangest thing about the Vestal virgins was not the power they held or the fragility of Rome whenever it brushed against vague omens. The strangest thing was the fact that, in an empire that never stopped boasting about reason and law, the fate of these women was decided by forces that could not be verified: the shape of a cloud, the cry of a crow, or the timing of a passerby's sneeze. Indeed, for Rome, messages from the gods could come from anywhere, except ordinary logic. If there was even a minor disturbance in a ritual, the crowd would whisper as if Jupiter himself were tweeting in thunderbolts across a clear sky. Priests panicked, throwing out theories no one asked for. Politicians immediately turned it into ammunition. And the most unfortunate of all were the priestesses standing in the middle of the storm, burdened with layers of spiritual meaning they had never asked to carry. Especially whenever Rome's stability wavered, the Vestals suddenly became the emotional barometer of the entire city. A smile slightly too bright, a sign of unrest; a misstep, a bad omen; a moment of silence, evidence of impending disaster. The Romans were always searching for something to soothe their hidden fear, that their mighty empire stood on a foundation more fragile than they cared to admit. And there was no one more convenient to blame than the women living at the center of the religious system, the very ones Rome had entrusted with maintaining the balance of the universe. However, those dark clouds did not always hang over their lives. In moments of peace, rare but real, the Vestals were seen as living embodiments of purity, power, and divine harmony. Romans praised them as symbols of good fortune. They smiled when a Vestal walked by, prayed when her white veil fluttered in the wind, and believed that anything a Vestal touched was witnessed by the gods. But that very admiration was a double-edged sword. When a group of people is worshipped too much, the world easily demands absolute perfection from them. A small mistake, or a mistake invented by a politician with an active imagination, was enough to turn a woman from a sacred mascot into the emblem of national sin. Strangely, in the stories that survived, even radiant innocence could not save them. Once, a Vestal was accused simply because she looked too sad during a ritual. The public whispered that it was a sign of divine displeasure. The elite suspected she was hiding some terrible sin, and so began an investigation full of theatricality, even though her only crime was likely just not getting enough sleep. That was Rome, a place where frowning at the wrong moment could be treated as an act of defiance against the gods. But there were also moments when the strength of a Vestal made Rome silently revere her. Many political crises were resolved simply by a Vestal appearing on the battlefield, where she raised her hand, and 2 armies, men armed to the teeth, immediately stopped, afraid to commit sacrilege by accident. Their power came not from doctrine nor from the sword, but from Rome's absolute belief that they were the link between the city and the cosmos. A single word from them could halt an execution, stop a war, or force officials to reconsider their decisions. Not because the law required it, but because everyone feared the supernatural consequences no one wanted to bear. However, that soft power also made them perfect pawns in political warfare. An accusation against them was an attack on both religion and political rivals. Ambitious figures recognized this early and used the Vestals as the final card in their power plays. Across centuries, many scandals involving Vestals likely never happened. They were simply stories crafted by those who needed them, and unfortunately, in the eyes of the public, who would dare question the will of the gods? Yet, amid all the panic and ritual, Rome had one unwavering belief that the Vestal virgins, no matter how often they were blamed, were the ones keeping the world from collapsing. The Romans believed that as long as they stood beside the sacred flame, the city would endure. Perhaps that belief was what made their retirement such a symbolic moment. 30 years standing on the knife edge between reverence and unjust death. 30 years balancing expectations imposed on their small shoulders. 30 years living like statues in the heart of the city, stared at, over-interpreted, scrutinized for every blink. And then on a quiet morning, they stepped out of the house of the Vestals, no longer bound, no longer watched, no longer carrying the stability of the entire empire. It was not merely a liberation, it was a rebirth. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time in decades, they were allowed to breathe, to err, to live. Rome could forget many things, but those who witnessed that moment would forever remember the image of a Vestal placing down with the same hand that had held the eternal flame and stepping into a life that had once been denied to her, not as a symbol, but as a human being. The rise and disappearance of the Vestal virgins reveal an irreversible law of history. Every tradition, no matter how sacred, will eventually be challenged by change. And as we follow each flame rekindled, each duty bestowed, we realize that the lives of these women were not only shaped by ritual, but also by a persistent struggle to preserve an identity slowly fading beneath the roar of a new era. But to understand that weight, we must look at the responsibilities they bore each day, the rituals that were both political and symbolic, and the isolation that only the chosen could understand. To be a Vestal Virgin was not simply to guard the fire. It was to occupy a position suspended between religion, power, and legend. Once chosen, these young girls stepped into a world where they were worshipped as symbols of purity, yet imprisoned by that very exalted status. They possessed privileges no other Roman woman could touch: owning property, being exempt from taxes, sitting in honored seats at festivals, and being so protected by law that anyone who harmed them could be executed. But in exchange came a binding vow that lasted 3 decades to keep the eternal flame from ever going out, to perform ceremonies that represented Rome's very existence, and to preserve their chastity, something the Romans believed could determine the fate of the entire empire. In every ritual, they served as living pillars of a superstitious city. When a Vestal walked through the streets, people stepped aside, not only out of respect, but because they believed she carried good fortune. When a condemned man was being led to execution, even an accidental encounter with a Vestal could spare his life, regardless of his crime. To Rome, these women were almost the embodiment of divine intervention in everyday life. But such reverence existed only if they were perfect. A single mistake could cost a life. If the flame went out, it was not merely negligence, it was an omen, and the Vestal responsible would be punished harshly. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was even more horrifying: to be buried alive. A slow, cold, symbolic death, as if Rome wanted to prove that breaking the sacred order meant being erased from the light of the gods. These fragments create a life both glorious and terrifying. Yet what makes their story remarkable lies not only in ritual, but in their impact on history. They once helped shift political tides, protect laws, and influence Rome's most powerful figures. A Vestal could write to the emperor, request clemency, or intervene in trials. In a world where women were confined to the household, the Vestals stood at the center of power, not as warriors or queens, but as living symbols of belief. However, when a new faith spread, their authority came to be seen as a relic of an old era. Rituals that once formed the city's soul were dismissed as superstition. Statues depicting their purity were left to decay in abandoned temple courtyards. And the flame, once considered the heartbeat of Rome, was extinguished without much resistance. In that fragile moment, Rome stepped through a new historical doorway, leaving behind a tradition that had shaped its spiritual identity. but their disappearance left a void. Not because rituals were missing, but because the people who embodied those rituals had vanished. The Vestals had been a conduit between the divine and the earthly, between belief and order. When they were gone, Rome did not collapse, but it was no longer the same Rome. The values, symbols, and rhythms that had sustained the city for centuries began to fade. Interestingly, even as the ancient world fell and the Middle Ages rose with an entirely new value system, the spirit of traditions like the Vestals continued to influence ideas about honor, duty, and ritual. In medieval villages, people no longer lit fires for gods, but they held athletic contests to affirm communal strength. In monasteries, they no longer guarded Vesta's symbol, but they cultivated intellect through strategic games. And in feudal society, honor was no longer tied to religious purity, as with the Vestals, but to strength, loyalty, and martial prowess. Seen this way, the silence of the Vestal flame was not an ending, but a transformation. One world closed so another could open, where people continued to seek meaning in rituals, in games, and in the tests of life. And even though time erases material remnants, their story still smolders like an ember, small but impossible to extinguish in the memory of history. But the jousts were only the beginning of a much larger world, one where glory was forged in steel and fear hid behind a shining shield. When the trumpets signaled the start of a match, the knights were not only fighting each other, they were fighting against oblivion. Because in an age where war measured a man's worth, a knight did not live on in memory through stories alone, but through feats witnessed by thousands of eyes. The snap of a shattered lance was a declaration: I am here. I am not anonymous. Young knights, often the younger sons of noble families, saw tournaments as their one chance to escape the shadow of an older brother or to prove themselves worthy of future titles. Meanwhile, seasoned knights hardened by real battles used them to remind the younger generation that experience could defeat strength. The hidden rivalry between regions and family houses made the atmosphere even more intense. A missed strike was not just a mistake, it could mean a loss of honor before an entire territory. But the tournament was not only about jousting, it was a festival of skill. After the violent clash of lances came contests of finesse and technique, sword fighting, horseback obstacle courses, and events simulating real combat. Every strike, every dodge, every lap was a moment that held the crowd's breath. A knight diving from his horse to avoid a blow? The crowd would roar with excitement as if witnessing a miracle. In the tents, the tension was just as palpable. Squires polished shields, checked every joint of the armor, tightened saddles, and prayed that their masters would return uninjured. Blacksmiths worked endlessly, repairing chipped swords or forging new lances after each match. For them, the tournament was also a showcase of skill. A good sword could save a life, and a sturdy saddle could keep a knight in the fight. Interestingly, despite the splendor, real danger lay beneath it all. Many knights suffered serious injuries, fell from horses, or were winded by blows too powerful. Matches meant to be performances sometimes turned into deadly battles, especially when conflicts between houses flared up. One wrong look, one strike taken too far, and the entire arena could descend into chaos. That is why referees and overseers were always on standby, ready to intervene before things spun out of control. What's notable is that for the masses, the tournament was not merely entertainment. It was an anticipated event, a day when common folk could see the nobility shine right before their eyes, no longer distant figures behind castle walls. Peasants came from far-off villages, bringing their families, food, and handmade goods. They treated it as a time for gathering, trading, matchmaking, and enjoying rare respite from farm work. Laughter mixed with trumpets, the clanging of hammers on anvils, and the rumble of merchant carts create a soundscape heard only during such festivals. And among all the excitement, there was always one moment everyone awaited: the honoring of the victor. When the finest knight's name was announced, cheers echoed across the field. He stepped forward to the beat of drums, dust clinging to his armor like the mark of triumph. A chosen lady, often the daughter of a local noble, placed a wreath upon his head, a gesture both proud and romantic. For some knights, that moment launched an entire career. For others, it was a brief shining star, yet enough to be remembered in tales for many festivals to come. But the tournament did not only represent the joy of the nobility. It reflected the values medieval society pursued: honor, loyalty, strength, and skill. Interestingly, when examined closely, the tournament resembled a miniature version of medieval warfare, a blend of artistry, strategy, and violence. Yet, unlike the battlefield where death always lurked, the tournament offered an illusion of control, a place where people could cheer a perfect strike without mourning its cost. Still, beneath all its splendor and ceremony, the tournament revealed a deeper truth. Medieval people craved structure. They wanted to believe in order, that if a man was strong, brave, and skilled, he deserved to be honored. A world where victory did not depend on favoritism, but on personal effort, at least within the arena. This is why tournaments became part of the era's consciousness, recorded in poetry, illustrations, and legends told for generations. But as with everything in history, tournaments did not survive in their original form. As times changed, weapons changed, military strategy changed, and traditional tournaments gave way to more regulated and safer forms of competition. And then, one day, they became memories, a magnificent silhouette of the past, embellished in literature and film, yet never fully recreatable. Even so, those festivals left us with one enduring truth. Humanity longs to witness courage, competition, and the spirit rising above everyday life. And in the echoes of steel clashing long ago, we can still hear the cheers of thousands, people who found joy, hope, and pride in a festival that embodied everything they revered. Medieval festivals were like breathing life into an entire community, pulling people out of the endless cycle of labor and placing them in the midst of scenes that were both chaotic and thrilling. When the church bells rang to signal the start of the festival, the cobblestone streets seemed to transform entirely, becoming a stage for countless games, sports, and spontaneous competitions that people had been eagerly awaiting all season. Men, women, children, nobles, monks, peasants, all blended together with none of the rigid boundaries of everyday life. In that brief period, people were allowed to laugh louder, run faster, and live more freely. Among the first lively games were feats of strength, stone throwing, tug of war, climbing slippery wooden poles, and village long running contests. Muscular men competed to hurl massive stones, powerful enough to make the ground vibrate when they landed. Excitement lit up the faces of the children who crowded in to see who would become the strongest in the village that year. Um, the air erupted with cheers every time someone broke a record, and the winner received simple rewards like a large loaf of bread, a barrel of ale, or the honor to boast about through the winter. But not every game belonged to the men. Women's foot races always drew large crowds, partly for their grace and partly for their fierce competitiveness. Linen skirts were gathered up to the knees for easier running, braided hair whipped in the wind, and laughter blended with cheers. For many participants, these races were not just entertainment, but rare opportunities to display energy, strength, and talent, qualities not always recognized in medieval women. Folk ball games, the ancestors of modern football, were the most chaotic events of the festival. There was no fixed field, no clear rules, and practically no limit to the number of players. Two groups from different neighborhoods surged toward each other like a tidal wave, trying to push a leather ball toward a designated spot at the edge of the village. Once the match began, the entire town seemed to turn into a miniature battlefield. Shouting, pounding footsteps, bodies colliding, and players tumbling into the mud created an atmosphere that was both wild and electrifying. Injuries happened from time to time, but for people of that era, these were moments when they felt more alive than ever. Alongside strength-based sports, festivals featured humorous and imaginative games. One such game was the King of the Grassy Hill, where a group of young men tried to stay balanced on a slippery mound while others pushed them from all sides. Whoever remained standing the longest was crowned the king, receiving a crown woven from dried grass. There were also sack races, stilts competitions, and log balancing challenges, games that could make both players and spectators laugh until their sides hurt. Meanwhile, the central area of the festival was often reserved for displays of skill and talent. Skilled archers shot arrows through spinning wheels or hit coins dangling on strings. Some were seasoned hunters, as comfortable with a bow as others were with their hands. Spectators watched them with a mix of admiration and longing, For in that time, a skilled archer was seen as a protector of the village against wild animals and enemies. A vital part of any festival was the music and dancing. Minstrels appeared with lutes, tambourines, and wooden flutes, telling stories of love, heroism, and humor through smooth melodies. As night fell and torches lit up the square, the circle dances began. People held hands and spun to the urgent rhythm, their steps syncing like the heartbeat of the entire community. These dances were not just entertainment, they were matchmaking grounds where a single glance could linger in someone's memory through the cold winter months. Children had their own share of the festivities. They ran between stalls selling honey cakes, dried fruits, wooden toys, and lucky charms. Games like spinning hoops, jump rope, and ring toss kept them laughing nonstop. Many village children from faraway rural areas saw their first wooden puppet or heard a wandering musician's flute on these festival days. For them, the event was like a doorway to a larger, more colorful world full of possibilities. Even more fascinating were the religious rituals woven seamlessly into the vibrant atmosphere. The church held communal prayers for good harvests and protection from illness. Priests blessed athletes, horseback riders, and those entering major contests. The blend of faith and festivity made the festival a place where religious spirit and folk joy intertwined naturally. On a deeper level, the festival allowed medieval society to reflect upon itself. It revealed the strength of the community, its simple joys, and its effort to rise above the hardships of daily life. During these days, people forgot about taxes, farm work, and feudal duties. They simply lived, laughed, competed, and celebrated. And in those seemingly ordinary moments, they created the cultural identity of their era, a blend of strength, faith, wit, and human connection. Babylon at this moment was like a giant body holding its breath. The night sky cast a faint bronze glow over the city's high walls, reflecting off the Euphrates River drifting silently as if unwilling to disturb whatever was happening inside the palace. Within the stone corridors, torches flickered, throwing the shadows of the guards across the walls like endless silhouettes, thin from sleeplessness, heavy with worry. The greatest empire of the ancient world was trembling above those flames. In the chamber where Alexander lay, the air was so thick it felt as if even the dust particles had paused, waiting. His generals, men who once laughed loudly beside campfires, who once barked commands amid pounding hooves and clashing metal, now stood in silence. Each carried his own fear, but all shared the same unspoken question. If Alexander dies, what will remain? For this empire was not built on treaties or councils. It was built on his will, so strong it seemed unbreakable. When he crossed the Hydaspes, people believed he was guided by the gods. When he survived an arrow through his lung, they believed he could not die like ordinary men. And now, before their eyes, was a truth too painful to accept. The king they thought immortal was struggling for every breath. A hot desert wind swept through the palace, stirring the silk curtains like Babylon itself was whispering. The royal physicians, men once confident in their medical knowledge, now lowered their heads, avoiding the general's eyes. They had tried herbal wines, summoned priests to pray, mixed concoctions bitter enough for only iron-willed men to swallow. But Alexander continued to fade, sinking like the sun slipping past the horizon without leaving a trace of gold. In the rare moments when he was lucid, he looked at the map spread on the stone table beside his bed. Blue and red lines, marking the roads he had traveled and those he wished to forge, now trembled with the faint breaths of their creator. It was said he tried to lift his hand, the same hand that swung a sword in battles that shook continents, to point toward the Arabian desert. A small gesture, but one that contained the essence of his life, always moving forward, even when his body betrayed him. Outside, the heavy steps of the guards echoed in slow rhythm. Soldiers who once marched with Alexander through the northern snows and the burning heat of Gedrosia now stood in long rows across the courtyard. No one ordered them to come. They came because their hearts would not let them be anywhere else. They waited, hoping, and each time the palace door creaked open, they lifted their heads with eyes full of desperate pleading. Inside, the generals debated in silence through their glances. Perdiccas feared the empire would shatter like a clay vessel dropped on stone. Seleucus thought of the trade routes he had dreamed of building. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, should have been by his side, but he had died not long before. The absence of the man who was like a second soul to the conqueror made the room feel even more empty and cold. At dawn that day, when the sun rose like a flame hastily scratched across the sky, Alexander's fever returned. Sweat rolled down his temples, so hot it soaked the silk beneath him. He forced his eyes open, looking at the familiar faces gathered around him, men who had fought for him, laughed for him, and perhaps would die for him if needed. In that moment, Alexander was not the immortal king the world imagined. He was simply a man, exhausted, trapped between the expectations of an empire and the limitations of his own flesh. Yet in his eyes a small light remained, fragile but unextinguished, a light that seemed to say that even if his body vanished, his vision would continue drifting across deserts, climbing mountains, living on through the paths he had carved. A tiny flame strong enough to make the ancient world tremble. When the fever eased briefly, Alexander whispered something. No one heard clearly, and the chamber sank again into its stone-like silence. But those closest swore they heard a name, not that of a general, nor of a city or distant frontier. It was the name of his father, a call back to his origins, as if his soul was peering into the deepest darkness to find its way home. And Babylon, in that moment, understood that a great chapter of history was closing. Not with the clash of swords or the smoke of war, but with the faint, fading breath of a man who had gone far beyond the limits the world once believed possible. The death of Alexander did not come with a roar or a sky-shattering cry. It unfolded so quietly that many in the room only realized it after several breaths had passed. A servant dropped a damp cloth. A general placed his hand on the king's chest, hoping for another breath, but there was none. Only that strange silence remained, the kind that made men who had heard the thunder of battle for 10 years tremble. In that moment, the greatest empire of the ancient world suddenly became as fragile as a mirror awaiting its first crack. Potticus, whose face had always been sharp and cold, froze like a stone statue. Tomley turned away, not out of weakness, but because he did not want anyone to see his reddened, wet eyes. The other generals whispered to one another, some trying to appear calm, others pale, as if all blood had drained from their bodies. They were men who had dared to challenge Persia, who had crossed mountains, crossed seas, crossed death, yet now they looked like children thrown into the heart of a storm. Then the bronze bell of the palace rang. It had previously been used only to signal danger within the city. This time its echo sounded like a declaration of the end of an era. Outside, soldiers crowding under the blistering Babylonian sun fell silent instantly. They understood. No messenger was needed, no formal announcement. The breath of the empire had ceased, and in some way that silence was far more terrifying than any scream. In that moment, no one thought of spoils, territory, or ambition. All they could think of was one thing. What would happen to them and to the world, now? That moment did not last long. Like a crack spreading across a massive glass pane called the Macedonian Empire, unity began to collapse layer by layer. The generals, once restrained by Alexander's prestige and power, now looked at each other as rivals. None wished to be the first to say it aloud, but their eyes revealed the truth. An empire this vast could not leave its throne empty, but none of them could sit on it without pushing the others into rebellion. Seleucus was the first to break the silence. He proposed placing Alexander's body in a cold chamber, guarding it strictly, and waiting for Roxana to give birth. If it is a son, he said, we will have a legitimate king. Tomley responded immediately, and in the meantime, who leads the empire? Who controls the treasury? Who negotiates with Persia, with the Greek cities, with the governors of the East? Each question was a blade slicing into the already fragile unity. Perdiccas watched silently, but every gaze turned toward him. The man controlling the palace, the man with authority over the royal guard, the one who could decide who entered the king's chamber and who was pushed out. In that quiet darkness, he became a shadow larger than his own body. And though Perdiccas did not utter a single word, his silence was more alarming than any shout. Outside the palace, the situation was no less volatile, like a barrel of oil dropped beside an open flame. Macedonian soldiers began forming factions within their camps. Veteran troops loyal to Craterus whispered they would follow only him. Younger, more ambitious men leaned toward Tomley, who was agile and politically savvy. Others mentioned Byron, a quiet general with a strange pull over the frontier troops. Within hours, groups of soldiers began securing city gates, food stores, and even the streets leading into the palace. Chaos did not erupt into bloodshed immediately, but it simmered like hot embers awaiting a strong gust of wind. As for the people of Babylon, craftsmen, merchants, slaves, they could only watch from a distance. They knew better than anyone that when a great king dies, it is the survivors who pose the greatest danger. Inside the inner palace, Alexander's body was laid upon a cold stone slab. Priests began the embalming rituals, trying to preserve his body until a final decision could be made regarding his burial. But even this became a center of dispute. One group, small in number but powerful, demanded his body be taken to Aegae, where the Macedonian kings were traditionally buried. Another argued that Alexander wished to be buried in Siwa, and that keeping him in Egypt would strengthen control over the empire's richest land. Behind each argument for tradition was a rough, unapologetic political calculation. Some generals understood that what happened to Alexander's body would determine what happened to the throne. Whoever controlled the king's corpse controlled the symbol of power. Whoever controlled the symbol of power controlled the loyalty of the army, and whoever controlled the army controlled the empire. That night, Tomley left behind one of the most chilling lines of his era. Alexander is dead, but his war is not. It was not a lament. It was a prophecy, because everyone knew. The death of Alexander was not the end. It was the opening shot. An empire too large for one man to rule, but too small to be shared by many. And from those arguments in the dark chamber of the Babylonian palace, the world was about to slide into a new age, the age of the successors, of brutal wars, of burning cities, and of men who were once brothers becoming mortal enemies. The death of the king was merely the final chapter of one story, but it was also the first chapter of a far bloodier era. In the chaotic years following the death of Alexander, the world seemed to be thrown into a bottomless vortex. The statues, once erected in his honor across Greek cities, now stood as symbols of a closed era, while his generals, the men who had crossed deserts, glaciers, and uncharted mountain ranges with him, were now busy carving their own names onto a new map with blood. But the greatest irony was this. Even as they tore each other apart, Alexander's image grew brighter than ever, as if he were still watching everything from above, smiling in some mysterious way. And it must be said, it was that very legend, that invisible presence they could never escape, that turned the wars of the Diadochi, the successors, into an unending chain of tragedies. When news of Perdiccas's defeat spread across the empire, many regions began to shake. The Greek cities, long accustomed to changing overlords, now faced a choice in a game where any general could become a king or a corpse. In Asia Minor, Antigonus saw Perdiccas's fall as a sign from fate that his time had come. Antigonus was a man with a vision so vast it bordered on the fantastical. He believed that only he was capable of reunifying the empire. But that ambition soon collided with another wall, the equally fierce ambitions of the remaining generals. In the west, Cassander, son of Antipater, began building his influence in Macedonia. Cassander was not a battle-hardened soldier like the others. He was a man who lived by cunning and ruthless patience, someone who understood that power lay not only in the sword but in outlasting one's enemies. When Antipater died, Cassander gradually broke the fangs of his rivals one by one, and soon he sought to eliminate entirely the remnants of Alexander's bloodline, including Roxana and her son. In the east, Seleucus, once driven out by Perdiccas, returned like an angry storm. No one expected the eastern cavalry he had forged in exile to become a force that made the entire subcontinent tremble. When Seleucus defeated his enemies and recaptured Babylon, a new chapter began, the expansion of his own empire. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Ptolemy, the man who had stolen Alexander's corpse, was turning the land along the Nile into a golden fortress. Under his hand, Egypt transformed from a province of the empire into a magnificent kingdom, stable, wealthy, and ruled with a mix of wisdom and iron. Alexandria, the city named after Alexander, quickly became the intellectual center of the world, a destination even Greek scholars dreamed of visiting at least once in their lives. But in every conflict, what astonishes historians most is not the number of territories conquered, but how personal each struggle was. The men who once shared meals in campaign tents now stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, carrying wounds no war could ever heal. Antigonus and Ptolemy had once been friends. Seleucus had served under Antigonus. Cassander had sent pleas for aid to several of them. All of them believed they understood Alexander better than anyone else, and each convinced himself that he alone was worthy of succeeding him. This made every battle heavier, every campaign bloodier, for they were not fighting merely for land, but for memory and pride. The fate of the Macedonian Empire was truly decided at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. It was the confrontation between Antigonus the One-Eyed and nearly the entire remaining body of the Diadochi. Antigonus, though old, still rode on horseback like a young commander. He believed that courage and willpower could overturn the odds, just as Alexander had once done at Issus and Gaugamela. But the age of miracles on the battlefield was over. When Seleucus's war elephants split the allied formations of Antigonus, the lines collapsed instantly. An arrow struck Antigonus in the chest. He fell, and with him, the dream of reuniting the empire died as well. From that moment on, there was no hope of restoring Alexander's empire. The world had entered a new age, the age of the successor kingdoms: Ptolemy's Egypt, Seleucus's Seleucid Empire, Cassander's Macedonia, and the Greek territories, each holding a fragmented piece of the great king's legacy. Yet, despite the world being divided, one thing endured: the name Alexander. As war engulfed the Mediterranean, stories of him grew ever more brilliant. People spoke of him as a god, a man who surpassed the limits of humanity. Children grew up hearing tales of Granicus, Issus, Hydaspes. Soldiers used him as the model of courage. Scholars analyzed his strategies like perfect mathematical problems, and even the successors, the very men who tore his empire apart, could not escape his shadow. In every proclamation, every campaign, every ambition, they had to invoke his name, as if, even in death, Alexander was still judging them. In the end, the empire dissolved, the generals and their descendants were replaced by new dynasties, and the sands buried the lands Alexander had once crossed. But that name, Alexander the Great, was never forgotten. He was not just a king, not just a warrior, but a legend that even the fiercest wars could not destroy. And perhaps that was his final victory. Amid the moss-covered mountain slopes and the silent valleys of Uria, the bond between the living and the dead was sustained not only by memory, but by sacred rites led by the priestesses, the keepers of the ancestors' flame. When a member of the clan died, the priestesses did far more than witness a farewell. They were guides, ensuring that the newly departed spirit did not wander aimlessly through the thick mist that separated the two realms. The Urian people believed that death was a journey, and without careful guidance, a soul could stray into rock crevices inhabited by fierce shadows or deceiving voices from the borderlands of the other world. During winter sunsets, when the last light touched the crowns of the oaks, the priestesses began the farewell ritual. They covered the body with pine leaves and rosemary, plants believed to open a passage through the spiritual night. There were no pyramids or grand stone tombs to display power. The Urian people believed that Mother Earth herself was the final home of every soul. Therefore, the priestesses chose soft soil at the mountain's foot, where a seasonal stream flowed past, to place the deceased into nature's eternal cycle. The ritual was not meant for mourning, but for transformation. As they chanted hymns centuries old, melodies rising and falling like wind through rock crevices, it was believed that the spirit of the dead was guided by their own ancestors. In that moment, the priestesses became the thread binding generations together, ensuring that no one in the tribe was forgotten in the darkness. The priestesses were not only keepers of death, they also guided life, especially in moments when the tribe's very existence was at stake. When neighboring clans rose up, fighting for land or water, the chieftains never made strategic decisions without consulting the priestesses. The ceremonial tent where they gathered was considered the spiritual heart of the community, a place where the fire never died, the embers glowing red through every night. In that flickering light, the priestesses listened to the wind, observed the smoke, or scattered grains onto the ground to interpret omens from the way they fell. A strong gust rushing through the pass could be interpreted as a warning that the coming war would be bloody. Conversely, Smoke rising straight into the sky during a prayer could suggest that the gods had blessed a swift and decisive campaign. These decisions, though mystical, carried practical weight. The Urian people believed that to ignore omens was to lose their spiritual strength, something as vital as sword and shield in battle. Not everyone could become a priestess. To be chosen, a young girl had to display rare signs, unusual sensitivity, prophetic dreams, or the ability to calm vicious animals. But even after being chosen, the path to priestesshood was not easy. Years of rigorous training required the girls to sit in silence for hours in the forest to sense the flow of energy around them, to memorize hundreds of ancient chants, and to master the preparation of herbs capable of easing fevers, calming the mind, or helping a dying warrior fight for one more day. Their power was not political, but spiritual, a kind of power that even the mightiest warriors bowed before. When a priestess entered the tribal council, the chieftains placed their shields on the ground, resting the tips of their swords on stone as the highest sign of respect. No one was allowed to interrupt her. For in the eyes of the Urian people, the words of a priestess were not mere opinions. They were messages from spirits who saw what mortal eyes could not. This power was most evident in seasons of despair, when drought stretched on, harvests failed, or game disappeared from the forests. In such times, the entire tribe gathered around the great stone circle on the hilltop, where the priestesses performed the rain-calling rite. Drops of honey were poured onto the fire, sending a sweet scent into the wind. As the priestesses sang, despair gradually transformed into hope. And even if the rain did not come immediately, the ritual provided the tribe with the most important thing, the faith to carry on. However, what made the priestesses the very soul of Uria was not merely their ability to foresee or to guide. It was their role in maintaining balance between humans and nature, between past and future, between the seen and unseen. They did not build empires or conquer new lands, but they preserved what every empire lacked, a profound harmony with the world around them. And perhaps that is why, in the memory of the Urian people, the priestesses were not distant symbols or unreachable legends. They were the heartbeat of the tribe, the wind in the forest, the firelight in winter nights, the keepers not only of ancestral spirits, but of Uria's very soul. When the trial of silence ended, the initiate entered the second phase, the journey through darkness. Not the darkness of the forest night, but the darkness within, where fear, doubt, and unresolved memories always lurk. The senior priestesses led her to a cave deep within the northern mountains, where the stone walls held a cold dampness like the breath of nameless spirits. Here, the initiate had to remain alone, with only a small candle and a bowl of water considered a mirror of the soul. Her task was to observe her reflection in the water, identify the intertwining fragments of memory, and name the things she feared most. The Urians believed that only by confronting one's own shadow could a priestess become pure enough to guide the tribe. Many told stories that in the moment the candle was about to go out, they heard whispers behind them, like the voices of ancestors, or sometimes like the calls of wandering spirits trying to pull them into despair. The initiate had to keep her mind steady as stone, for if she ran or cried for help, the ritual would fail, and she would have to wait until the next moon cycle to try again. When she stepped out of the cave at dawn, her eyes, though weary, glimmered as if they had seen a new layer of meaning in the world. This meant she was ready for the next trial, the covenant with nature. Without this connection, the Urians believed a priestess could not interpret omens or call upon the spirits of the ancestors for aid. The covenant took place at a sacred hot spring nestled between two towering cliffs. Elder priestesses guided the initiate into the warm water, where rising mist resembled gathering spirits. They scattered seasonal flowers, mostly purple gentian and petals of a rare blossom that opened only at dawn, over the surface. The initiate had to immerse herself in the spring, keeping her body as still as a lake, while the priestesses whispered ancient incantations, asking nature for permission for her to become a messenger between the two realms. Meanwhile, the initiate felt the movement of the water around her, sometimes gentle as silk, sometimes swirling like mountain wind. They believed the gods themselves were touching her, testing whether her heart was pure enough to carry sacred power. When the ritual ended, the flowers drifted into a natural circle around her, symbolizing the acceptance of the spirits of the land. But to become a true priestess, the girl still had to overcome one final trial, the test that determined her resolve, wisdom, and sensitivity, the Night of Voices. On this night, the initiate was taken to a sacred forest where ancient trees stood so tall that people believed their roots touched the bones of ancestors. There was no fire, no companion, no instructions. She had to walk deep into the forest, searching for a place where the air shifted, where the wind, according to Urian belief, carried messages from the spirits. Her task was to listen, not with her ears, but with her heart. In that darkness, any sound could be a sign: a snapping twig, an owl's call, dripping water, or the movement of small creatures. But she had to distinguish which sounds were natural and which were the voices of the unseen world. Successful initiates described feeling an invisible hand touch their shoulder or hearing their names called, not to frighten them, but to guide them. When the initiate found the true call, she would light a small plume of smoke using juniper herbs from her pouch, a signal of acknowledgement. If the smoke rose straight into the sky, it was a sign that the ancestors approved and the ritual was complete. If the smoke dispersed or swirled close to the ground, the Urians believed she was still unready, and the path to priestesshood remained long. When she returned to the village with the spent smoke bowl, everyone gathered around the fire to welcome her. The senior priestesses placed on her forehead a mark of sacred ash made from leaves that grew on the graves of the tribe's most revered individuals. This ash symbolized wisdom, memory, and inheritance. From that moment on, she was no longer an ordinary Urian child. She was the link between past and present, between the living and the unseen. The ritual ended with the dance of rebirth. A great fire was lit in the center of the square, and the new priestesses, along with their mentors, moved in spirals symbolizing the heartbeat of the universe. Drums thumped rhythmically, blending with ancient chants. The villagers stood around them, hands over their hearts, as a vow to trust, honor, and protect the priestess, who now bore the responsibility of keeping the tribe in harmony with both the visible and invisible worlds. From that day forward, every step she took carried responsibility, easing sorrow, healing illness, listening to the voice of the earth and sky, and maintaining the balance that the Urians believed their tribe would collapse without.